For those who don't know me, let me tell you something. I'm a sucker for crazy creatures that are tormenting a town or people. The reason why I'm telling you this is because today we'll be covering the Twitter semi-ARG called Weird Birds, created by Arcasuchus. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I'm trying. And genuinely, I'm ashamed of myself for being this late to the party. I'm obsessed with these types of threads, which should be obvious since I covered other Twitter threads, so the fact that I discovered this last year and it took me this long to finally get around to it, honestly, I deserve to get eaten by a dinosaur bird creature thing. But better late than never, I guess, and now I can say that this is one of my top favorites. What can I say? Again, I'm a sucker for crazy visuals and mysterious creatures, especially this cute little guy. I love this little guy. By the way, I'm going to cover the first part of this series today, and there's going to be a reason for this, I swear, but regardless, if you're interested to hear the story of weird birds and you want to know more about these odd creatures and what the protagonist is forced to face throughout their whole journey, then sit back, relax, maybe get a snack, and as always, my name is Estrella. Let's explore. Weird Birds, Part 1. In the beginning of the thread, we get told that the protagonist's dog has been barking constantly at the back door for the past few days, so to discover the issue, the protagonist sat with him until he started to bark again, and once that happened, the protagonist snapped a photo and captured this, an odd-looking creature. The creature fled soon after being discovered, and this alarming incident made the protagonist post a warning to others to be careful outside, specifically to those living in the Chicagoland suburbs. We then get told that none of the protagonist's family members were able to identify the animal, but luckily the protagonist isn't the only one who encountered the creature, because during a garage sale while talking to the neighbors, the protagonist noticed a drawing from the neighbor's 6-year-old. It was a simple illustration of the creature he saw last night, and the protagonist decided to call this mysterious creature Weird Bird. And once the sun started to fall, the protagonist decided he wanted to gather more information, so he went outside with his dog and phone, and while walking, he managed to record the calls from the mysterious animal creature, which we can actually listen to. We can even see the creature's eyes in the background of the dog's photo, which is reminiscent to a hunting animal that's stalking its prey. If something bad happens to this dog, I swear. Anyways, after this discovery, you'd think the protagonist would be extra cautious, but he decided to leave his back door unlocked for a test, and something did broke in and unexpectedly ate his leftover chicken. But that was all that was taken. And at first there was an assumption that the animal was gone, but it soon was spotted outside and it eventually re-entered the house, which we see a photo of, and there was a bit of a standoff, but the protagonist managed to sneak off and heard an ominous shriek outside before eventually getting the opportunity to lock all the doors once the coast was clear. Following after this, some investigation was done, and it's obvious that these feathered creatures are foreign to the community, but at least we know it's 5 feet, smart, nocturnal, potentially smelly, and it's not afraid of humans like a normal animal. Additionally, when investigating outside during the daytime, animal matter/pellets with bone fragments and seemingly a bun, along with tracks in the dirt, was discovered, but that's not all. A new animal was soon spotted, and it was compared to a mutated bird. It's small and skittish, and it was seen fighting another bird-like creature over a mysterious object. They tugged and tugged until suddenly blood poured out, and the object those animals were fighting over turned out to be a shoe with a kid's foot, which made the protagonist vomit a bit. Anyways, while looking away, the foot unexpectedly vanished, likely taken away by those birds, and the cops were presumably called, but they didn't arrive. Regardless, the main priority at this moment for the protagonist is to contact animal control at some point. It was then discovered the neighbors weren't around despite their lights being on, and unexpectedly a crumpled drawing from the neighbor's kid was discovered outside, and in the picture it seems like the kid fed those creatures, which is obviously alarming. Speaking of alarming, something suddenly landed on the protagonist's rooftop and made scratching noises before moving to the backyard. Presumably, it was the same large creature from before, and when the protagonist looked outside, there was a trail of feathers leading to somewhere. However, the protagonist refuses to follow it because that would be stupid. As for any videos that were taken of the situation, we get to hear the calls of the animal again, but this time there were multiple. It was pretty unsettling, and unexpectedly when our protagonist looked outside, the trail of feathers was gone. Additionally, a voice could be heard outside, but something was wrong with it, and the protagonist believes that whatever landed on his rooftop is still around. He described the creature as spindly, and the only bright side to the situation is that at least one recognizable and normal animal appeared during this, which was a bat, but it was still a bit odd. Speaking of animals, where's the protagonist's dog? Luckily, he was taken to the protagonist's grandmother's home earlier, so he'll be safe for now. Returning back to the protagonist, we hear another recording, this time of the unusual voice that was mentioned before, and the protagonist believes it's that mysterious animal trying to lure him outside. To make a comparison, it's kind of like a parrot that can mimic people's speeches, but you know it's not exactly a human talking. But anyways, what makes the situation worse is that apparently there's 2 of the animal creatures outside of the protagonist's home stalking him. Left with no other options and the lack of desire to go outside, the protagonist decides to hunker down in the basement. However, at some point he needed a charger for his phone, which was left upstairs, so eventually he had to go back up. Sadly, while upstairs, the sounds of glass shattering and a thud could be heard. Now, the protagonist is only on 3% on his phone and making the situation very bad, but luckily he managed to escape through a window before whatever broke in could get him. He's now in his car, which allowed him to charge his phone since one was inside, and soon enough the daytime arrived, and for some terrible reason, the police aren't responding when the protagonist calls. But ignoring that, while looking around from the safety of his car, the protagonist spotted another animal creature, this time in his neighbor's porch, but it seems shy and it was hiding a bit, so it doesn't seem like it's deadly at the moment. So eventually, the protagonist gained the courage to step outside of his car, and he discovered that one of those giant animals that stalked him were killed and beheaded outside. This was kind of a relief until suddenly animal screams could be heard, and also a new very strange sound. It was deep, drowned out, and nothing like the protagonist ever heard before, and unexpectedly, the crickets in the area stopped chirping. And speaking of noises, a recording was posted of the creature, and the protagonist explains that it's loud and sounds massive. The protagonist also can feel the noise reverberate throughout his body, and it makes his hair stand on end. But stepping away from that for a moment, the protagonist can't use his car anymore due to the fact that he used up all its power by leaving the AC on, so of course the battery died. So he went back inside his home, and unexpectedly a deer showed up, attempting to enter the house, and noticeably its eyes were wide. It's also missing an antler, but regardless, when it noticed the protagonist, it ran away, which I find alarming because the deer is for some reason trying to enter a human building, which makes me assume that it's running away from something that was in the forest area. But moving on, outside of the home could suddenly be heard crashing sounds along with wailing, and the protagonist believes that the second big bird from the night before is sitting outside. In addition to that, a voice could be heard outside, which the protagonist believes could be the police. However, it was quickly discovered that instead, it was the weird bird creatures attempting to lure him out. This is also when the protagonist discovered that the foot he discovered earlier likely belonged to the neighbor's kid, because suddenly he could hear the bird trying to mimic the speech of a kid calling out to their father. Pretty messed up. Speaking of which, suddenly outside was spotted a trail of shoes, which was odd. But the next strange thing to happen was when the deep, mysterious noise from before returned, which unexpectedly caused the bird creature to leave. Now, because of this mysterious noise, the protagonist can't step outside, so just like before, he decided to hunker down in the basement, but this time he remembered to bring a charger along with food and water. He plans to stay there and not leave, however, the following day when he woke up, something felt off about the house. He's not alone. The sounds of footsteps could be heard. We then see footage of our protagonist running away and likely hopping over a fence, and the reason for this footage is because there was 3 big dinosaur birds in the house attempting to smell him out. So the protagonist had no choice but to jump and run out of his window, but they still seemed to have been chased for a bit. We also get another key detail about the animals, and according to the protagonist, they are similar to velociraptors. But anyways, the protagonist had to run into the forest and camp for a short bit before eventually he could return to his house. And outside was unexpectedly, and incredibly, a huge creature which was unsettling, but at least the protagonist made it back inside his home and barricade as much as he could. However, the cricket stopped making noises again, alerting the protagonist that something was outside, which was true. It's a big boy. And despite its size, it can move both quietly and gracefully, which is disturbing. However, the next alarming thing to happen is the sounds of a woman crying outside, which made the protagonist react for a second. However, regardless of how bad he felt, he knows that he can't check outside. The sounds of the woman crying then changed to the sounds of screaming, and it was soon discovered that she was an actual woman and not a fake voice attempting to lure the protagonist outside, and the revelation hit hard. But the protagonist had to focus on his own survival, and soon enough 3 days passed, and he still hunkered down in his home. During this day, bizarre noises and more screams could be heard until suddenly downstairs there was the sound of footsteps, and outside the window was breathing. When looking outside, the big animal creature from before was spotted out there. Ugh. The protagonist then makes the connection that the deep booming noises from before was coming from the large creature, and luckily it seemingly doesn't seem to notice the protagonist is there. Additionally, at some point, the screaming from the people stopped, but that didn't relieve all the protagonist's concerns because while looking at an image that he took earlier, he spotted something that confused him. The protagonist then continues to snap photos of these creatures, and it doesn't seem like they mind the flash from his phone. Speaking of photos, way earlier, before everything that happened, the protagonist remembered snapping a photo of a piece of paper he discovered while walking his dog, and he believes it to be a police sketch which resembles the bird creatures that he's been seeing. This is important to mention despite how late it is, because the implications mean that these animals have been around for a while if other people alerted the police and had sketches done. More on this later. Now, the protagonist is struggling to get any sleep for obvious reasons. More noises are continuing to be heard outside, an example being the sounds of crying, so the protagonist has to come up with an escape plan to get away. He actually had a friend who was meant to drive him out of the state, but it's been 10 hours, so that's likely not an option, and when looking outside, the protagonist spotted some strange lights in the backyard and sky. All of this is very alarming, so he wanted to retreat to his basement, but sadly he couldn't go to his basement because one of those lightning things were down there, and it doesn't help that his body started to feel very weak. The protagonist feels like he's about to throw up, and there's also a grotesque smell in the area, but when the lights vanished, so did the smell, which was confusing. And to make matters worse, there's something happening to the protagonist's phone because when he tries to record, the audio is replaced with static. Luckily, that was temporary, and the protagonist soon posted the sounds of police and ambulance alarms. Meaning that help should be arriving, right? Well, after everything that happened, of course the protagonist has a bit of trust issues, and when the sound of knocking and police officers could be heard outside, the protagonist wasn't sure what to do, so he kinda just froze for a bit until eventually he mustered the courage to answer the door, but there was nobody outside. The crickets have also returned and everything was just still. Now the next day rolls around and a mysterious man was standing outside of the protagonist's door, which of course he didn't answer. Instead, he took a photo and waited it out until the man eventually left, and to ease his mind after this, the protagonist looked at his dog's crate for comfort, and unexpectedly a small bird somehow managed to get inside, which he soon took a photo of, and I will not lie, it's kind of cute, in a weird way. It's not aggressive or scared of the protagonist, so it's kind of like a new pet, and it accepts the food that the protagonist offers it. This bird will be called Mike, and it has privileges to be outside of the cage until it's time to go to bed, in which it has to return to the cage for obvious safety reasons. Speaking of going to bed, the protagonist and Mike went to sleep for the night until they abruptly woke up to the sounds of screaming and gunfire outside, and it seems like there's a lot of people. Mikey was stressed out from all these noises and eventually flew into the ceiling because there was a loose tile that allowed him to go in. Now the protagonist is stuck listening to the sounds of Mikey crawling around, but at least the gunfire is starting to calm down. Then suddenly the scratching noises from the ceiling and attic started to become more noticeable, and when we hear the recording of the sounds and even see an image of a whole lot of eyes, we can rightfully assume that Mikey has a lot of siblings. There's also a larger creature inside, but our protagonist doesn't see it because it's pretty dark. And the reason why it's dark is because the power has been going in and out, which is obviously a pain, but that's not the worst thing, because once the lights were completely out, the off-putting voices have returned, and this time it's of a woman and a young child, and the woman is trying to comfort the child who seems to be hurt. These voices are coming from the ceiling, and additionally, the sounds of scraping and breathing could be heard as if something was stuck there, so the protagonist checked and discovered a much larger bird that isn't Mikey. The protagonist believes that he's going to die, and while hiding, he suddenly receives a message from someone named Fitch. It's a screenshot of a national alert, specifically an evacuation notice, and it mentions mysterious creatures wreaking havoc, and that staying indoors doesn't seem to help, which is why the residents in the area need to leave. Our protagonist is very familiar with being stuck in a terrible situation, and Fitch sent another image of them encountering one of these odd creatures, to which our protagonist tells them that they need to be armed and to find safety immediately. They then have a discussion about people in uniforms being the only ones they've seen outside, who are honestly a mystery, and later they decided to make plans to meet up and to find a potential shelter with each other, and Fitch is going to drive. As for our protagonist, his car is obviously out of commission, especially after being crushed, so he has to figure out another way to leave. We then get a bit of a time skip, and the protagonist manages to leave his house since Mikey was making a lot of noises that distracted the larger creatures, and the protagonist also waited the creatures out until he got an opening. Once the coast was clear, the protagonist somehow discovered an underground tunnel, which helped him get out of Illinois. He then soon met up with his friend, however something off camera happens, which seems to have been a really big incident, which ended with the protagonist's friend and his car being gone, and the protagonist saying that he misses his friend, so I'm assuming something really bad happened. Sadly, there's no time to mourn, and the protagonist returns to the tunnels, and while wandering in the tunnels, something clearly felt off and he kept returning to the same spot. Additionally, it felt like there was something else in the tunnels with our protagonist, which we see a photo of, and it's a good thing that our protagonist decided to leave despite ending up in an unfamiliar location, because that thing does not look friendly, especially since it has flesh in its mouth. Now the next problem that the protagonist has to face while on the surface is the lights from before. They can change color, noticeably being green here, and seem to be freaking out. These lights also seem to tamper with technology because they eventually screwed with the protagonist's phone again, and one of these lights actually appeared right next to our protagonist, which he soon describes to us that he had a feeling as if he was being drawn to it, and while looking at the light, it seemed like the protagonist could see trees, but he managed to resist its temptation and not go in. However, a part of the protagonist regrets not going. Our protagonist then states that he believes he's being trailed by something, and it could be the bird-like animals from before, however larger. Regardless, he soon sought shelter in a cemetery, and as for food and water, he had to drink when it rained, and the last meal he had was roadkill. Surviving is pretty difficult, and it doesn't help that many of the stores were ransacked. But more importantly, suddenly the protagonist could hear something outside. The sounds of people panicking and saying the words, "Get down, we need to something something." And at some point, something started to happen to the protagonist's body. You know the feeling of a leg falling asleep? That's what the protagonist is experiencing all over, but more intense, and he compares the sensation similar to when he first was confronted by the bright lights that appeared next to him a while back. He calls the lights a wormhole, and after some time, the protagonist realized that his phone was working again, and it was fully charged. The only assumption to why it was fixed could be because of the wormholes. He soon took a photo of his surroundings, however it was pretty foggy, so it's hard to make out anything, but we can clearly see that one of those dinosaur bird-like creatures is close by. The protagonist soon heard the sound of crunching, which he compared it to the sounds of bones snapping. Putting two and two together and learning from past experiences, he assumed that there's bird-like creatures in the area and might be eating something that was once alive. Though not wanting to be the next meal, the protagonist started to run, and yes, his camera was working, but sadly the audio is still acting up. And at some point, the bird stopped looking for the protagonist because the lights appeared, which the animal immediately started to fight, and it was pointed out that the lights were red. Using this as an opportunity, the protagonist continues to run until he eventually finds somewhere safe to hunker down at night. But unexpectedly, he started to hear noises that reminded him of Mikey, the bird companion from earlier. And it was! I love this bird, I'm not going to lie. Anyways, Mikey arrived with a few others of his kind, and he came with food, which brought a smile to the protagonist's face. The protagonist accepted the offer of the fish head while Mikey ate the body and tail, and while sitting in silence, suddenly people could be heard in the distance. Mikey and the protagonist laid low to listen, and it seemed like these people were coming closer. As a result, Mikey's flock fled, however Mikey remained by the protagonist's side. Now that's loyal. And during this tense moment, it was quickly discovered that these voices aren't regular people because the voices were being followed by the sounds of rattling that come from the creatures from before. Speaking of which, the protagonist and Mikey were eventually found by the creature due to the lack of any hiding spots, so they had to run, but Mikey stayed behind to flap his wings frantically and to fly up a tree to distract the creatures as much as possible. This allowed the protagonist to get some distance, and then he arrived at an abandoned strip mall in which he hid in an alley. But before hiding, he managed to capture an image of the creature, and it indeed was the unknown bird creature, but with noticeable red eyes. Regardless, the protagonist managed to survive the night, and he eventually went back to find Mikey once the sun went up, but he couldn't find him, so the protagonist just hopes he's safe. Another thing he points out to us is that the red lights are becoming more common, and a photo was captured which shows the red lights stretching out for miles. The protagonist then suddenly started to hear sounds that he believes are connected to the red lights. It's not talking, or more like it's hard to recognize anything that's being said, and it's clearly not human. Further investigating, the protagonist discovers something that's 7 foot tall and seemingly not paying any attention to its surroundings because it's busy eating a pumpkin or something. A photo was taken, and I don't know what that is, and what makes things worse is that its face splits open and it starts hissing at the protagonist. Ew. The creature then chased the protagonist outside of the woods while making more bizarre talking sounds, but luckily nothing happened to the protagonist besides him feeling paranoid, and soon enough he stumbled across a road, and while walking, suddenly the protagonist started to feel extremely sick. Everything hurts, and he even vomited. Not only that, but when he checked his phone, noticeably the camera wasn't functioning properly. The protagonist then explains that he feels like his eyes are about to explode and that he can barely feel his senses. It's like he's going to die and there's something right in front of him, but sadly the camera couldn't capture it fully in the state that it's in. We can assume that this is a pretty bad situation, but I think the protagonist got lucky because despite potentially passing out, he woke up in the cold and is still alive. Of course, his body feels a little numb and he's surrounded by bits of snow, but at least he's not like the person that's brutalized in the road ahead of him. But anyways, the sudden freezing weather seems to have killed off small prehistoric creatures in the area, which we see photos of, and the protagonist is obviously concerned for Mikey because he is on the smaller side. And honestly, looking at these smaller creatures makes me feel a little sad, and even the protagonist feels a little guilty for them as well, because it seems like they can only survive the one night before passing in the cold. And you know what? The worst soon comes. The protagonist eventually finds Mikey on the ground, lying there, unmoving. This of course broke the protagonist's spirit because Mikey was the only thing he had left that was a source of comfort. This situation sucked, but after sitting with Mikey for a bit, the protagonist eventually gained the strength to walk aimlessly until he stumbled across the sounds of a baby crying, but it turns out it wasn't actually a baby, but a creature. And at this point, the protagonist decided that it was time to do a final showdown with the creature, and the two battled until the sun started to fall. Both were badly injured, and the only weapon the protagonist had was a rock for hitting and a flashlight to disorient. The protagonist believes he likely broke something during this fight, and there was was a lot of chasing and standoffs until eventually a pack of stray dogs arrived, which scared the creature away. This was obviously unexpected, but the most surprising thing about this was the fact that the protagonist's dog, Archie, was there. Remember the one from the beginning of the story? The two had a quick reunion until ultimately Archie decided to follow the pack of dogs so they could continue to hunt down any more of the creatures and to be free. Honestly though, that's kind of a vibe. The protagonist wanted to follow him, but he was too weak, so he remained in place and waited for the sun to rise again in order to better look at his injuries in the light. It was bad to say the least, and at some point, familiar wheezing sounds could be heard nearby. It was Mikey's flock of friends. They might not be Mikey, but it was comforting to know that a few of his kind were able to survive the cold, and the small creatures were kind enough to bring food for the protagonist, but sadly, he didn't have the strength to eat it. Not sure how else they could help him, the creatures stayed by the protagonist's side, just to be there for his final moments, and that was enough for the protagonist. And with the last bit of charge left in his phone, he left a goodbye message on his account, leaving everyone following his journey both sad and curious about the events that just happened to him. Tragic. And this is the end of the story. Well, technically, this is not the end of the story, as mentioned in the beginning, but we're going to save the rest for part 2. Yes, I know, splitting videos into 2 parts suck, but it makes sense in this story because this is seemingly the end of the Chicago guy's story, which is the protagonist. So before I jump into the second part of the story, I want to share my thoughts and predictions for the second part, so once we cover it, we can see how smart or dumb I am. Now let's move on to the conclusion. Conclusion. The story is of a man trying to live an ordinary life with his dog in the suburbs when suddenly he started to get tormented by unknown bird creatures reminiscent to dinosaurs and other larger beasts. These creatures firstly picked off the neighbors and are definitely wreaking havoc in the state since an emergency alert for an evacuation was issued. Most people got away, others didn't. These creatures are smart and deadly. They have brilliant hunting instincts and can lure their prey out by mimicking human voices. They can either be small and fly or huge and crush anything in sight. These are the obstacles the protagonist has to face while attempting to leave for safety, and the only time he accepted one of these creatures was when he formed a friendship with a smaller one that he named Mikey, and arguably Mikey did a lot of work, playing distraction to keep the protagonist safe and alive. MVP, honestly. Regardless, these creatures aren't the only threats happening in the world. There's these strange lights that are affecting both body and technology. They come in a variety of colors, but we mostly see red. And are these lights good or evil? I think there could be an argument for both sides. Now, obviously, screwing with technology is annoying, but more importantly, inflicting sickness and suffering to people close to it is a major thing that makes these lights/wormholes so dangerous. It can knock anyone down and make it easier for any creature to pick them off while they're weak. However, it seems like the bird dinosaur creatures don't like these lights either. It's been shown before that the creatures were irritated with the lights and attempted to fight it, so maybe these lights are in a bit of a gray area? They don't benefit humanity, but there seems to be an odd situation happening with the creatures too, and this leads me to my big question. Where did these lights come from, and why is it spreading? If I had to guess, I feel like these lights have to have a connection with the creatures, and the protagonist calls them wormholes for a bit, and what are wormholes? A tunnel from one place in space to another. When these lights appear, there's always a creature in the area, and I believe these lights are transporting these creatures. And I also think at some point these lights teleported the protagonist, you know, when they woke up in the cold. Maybe you can just teleport people, Additionally, maybe there's some weird time traveling shenanigans since these things do look like dinosaurs. Or maybe these creatures were created in a lab and later transported through portals? Maybe, I'm not 100% sure about this, but clearly something unbelievable is happening because again, these creatures resemble dinosaurs that can mimic human voices, and these lights can teleport people? Like, it's pretty unusual stuff. Also, I remember in the way beginning that these creatures were a lot less aggressive when first released due to the drawings we saw from the neighbor's kid. You know, they interacted with the kid for quite a bit and didn't eat it for a while, giving the kid enough time to draw the creatures. So clearly, they weren't always aggressive, but I guess some days something snapped within them, and maybe the lights could be to blame? Again, these creatures are a little strange, and maybe they're like sleeper agents, and the lights triggered them to go into hunting mode. This is starting to make me believe that these lights are becoming more and more evil. So many theories. Anyway, stepping away from that for a moment, one thing in the story that was hardly brought up again that I found interesting was the mysterious man standing outside of the protagonist's door, the sounds of people and gunfire in the streets, and the text messages discussing about people in uniforms outside. These seem to be pretty specific details just for it to be nothing in the long run. So for the next part, I predicted that there's either a secret organization or the government is involved in some way, and they are either doing damage control or are observing the behaviors of these creatures and lights. Maybe this was all an experiment done for the purposes of creating new life and to have better access to multiple locations and times in space. It might be causing a lot of pain and suffering to the people in Illinois and likely the world, but sacrifices must be made, and the government or secret organization only cares about the research and results they're getting from all this chaos. I also did get spoiled for one thing. There's going to be some aquatic creatures, I believe. How will this come into play? I'm not sure, but maybe, hear me out. These creatures that we've been seeing are actually normal animals that we can find in everyday life, but mutated. And now this mutation is affecting the waters. Maybe the lights triggered a transformation in the animals, or they were given drugs. Whatever the case is, there's a chance that these creatures didn't just spawn into existence, and they were always around and just evolved like a Pokemon. But that's kind of a crack theory. I don't know. All of my guesses can be debunked by the time we get to the next part, so let's just hold on to all of that until the next video. With that being said, this is the Weird Bird series created by Arkasukis. Again, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. This was a pretty cool series to cover with very fun art and visuals, and if you want to get ahead of the game and see the next part now, the link to the account is in the description. But first, if you made it this far, I hope that means you enjoyed the video, so please don't forget to like, subscribe, do that funny little notification thing, follow my other social medias, maybe leave a comment, and I better not catch you dying on me. Goodbye!